Hello, this is the last type of government intervention that we're going to look at, and it's unfortunately it's a really big area. It's regulation. So we're going to look at how the government can use regulation to try to correct market failure, and we're going to look at the pros and cons of this particular method. So regulation is rules or laws, legislation imposed by the government, and usually backed with the use of penalties, so fines if you don't follow this regulation. It depends on what type of regulation it is. For breaking the most serious regulations, you could have custodial sentence, so be sent to prison. And this is a link here to the government's website, where they talk about the laws surrounding seatbelts. So in summary, the regulation is that you have to wear your seatbelt if you're in a car, a moving car that is, that's being driven, not just maybe a stationary one. And the penalties are that you can get a fine on the spot of £100, and if you're prosecuted, taken to court for this, I don't know what would kind of differ, but maybe how polite you are to the police officer, possibly, you can get prosecuted. So it's a maximum £500 fine. So that is a form of regulation. Now, when we're looking at regulation with a case study, you've got to really think about what's happening, and often it's quite complicated because often it can affect demand and supply. So I'm going to get out my drawing tools, and these are just going to be rough diagrams, so I might not label every curve or every axis or every equilibrium point, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't in your exam. It's just because I'm trying to be quick about this. So here we have some legislation, regulation that came in a few years ago that says that you have to put these kind of very graphic images, particularly unappealing images, on cigarette packaging, tobacco packaging of any kind, and this is mainly to, here we go, alter demand. So we have demand sloping downwards, and you see these packages and you think, oh, that is horrible, that is not very nice, and it reduces your demand because it's a kind of taste and fashion factor. Now this one here is reducing actually the supply in the market, so making it illegal for firms to sell to different individuals. I don't know why I put a number 12 there. Don't know what I was thinking of, but that can actually reduce the supply in the market. So because it's actually really very heavy fines that shops get imposed or have to pay if they're known to be selling to underage people. And also, recent legislation that came in with smoking was that you're not allowed to see the packaging now. It's all behind those kind of cupboards or, you know, units that they have now. So again, that's to try and curb demand. Drinking here, we've got some things that reduce supply. So pubs, shops not allowed to supply, and they do that kind of like challenge 21 or challenge 25 these days, which, you know, they still ask me for ID. Still feel quite youthful. But here we can see this is actually, I think this was actually from an Australian poster that I found, and they had their license suspended for 14 days because they sold to 3 minors. So I assume that's under the legal, minors being under the legal drinking age. So that limits the supply, whereas these ones, that's a little bit of packaging that's found on, I think it's a wine bottle, that should limit demand, so that should reduce demand. There we go, so push it inwards, okay? And these things, I think it's, it's a little bit of both. Maybe this is in Belfast. So pubs might limit their supply to anybody that they think is going to leave the establishment, but also that might reduce demand in certain, you know, like little Tesco Expresses and little Sainsbury's local, for people just kind of buying alcohol and then sitting on the street and those types of things. So you've just got to the moral of the story is here, you've just got to think, is it going to affect the producer, is it going to affect the consumer? Okay, it's not though all about reducing the quantity in the market. We might have things like this, which this actually looks not that great because it's got a lot of saturated fat, but if it was a very healthy product, it might actually increase the demand because you're providing more information, and so this is trying to curb information failure. And Change for Life as well might reduce the demand for high in salt, high in fat, high in sugar foods, but it might increase the demand for things like gym memberships and swimming lessons and things like that, which that's trying to help. This is the healthy eating standards legislation as well that I got from the government website. So that might reduce the supply of unhealthy food and increase the supply of healthy food. So again, you've got to think about usually packaging and information. That's usually to change the consumer's point of view, and then anything that's more kind of like legal restrictions on how things can be sold, that's going to be the producer's point of view. So that's going to be supply that's going to move. Education as well has regulation. You need to go to school. That's the law, and we can see that there's some fines if you don't send your child to school on a regular basis. So I think the threshold is about, it differs for councils, but with my students I always say the threshold for like regular attendance for me is 95%. You've got to get above 95%. Everyone has a few days in a year that they might be under the weather, they've got to go to the dentist, they're not very well, but 95% is what you should be aiming for. That's what good students would have. And so the fine maybe discourages people from truanting or taking term time holidays. So it might mean that demand, or I would assume that the demand in this case would increase. So this can be legislation again that affects demand. So it is difficult. You just have to look at the case study and you have to think, would this be supply or this be demand? Okay, here's some pros and cons. I've not actually filled in the analysis. I'm just going to talk about them. It can be expensive to enforce because you've got to initially enforce the law, and then you've got to get people to abide by it. So you've got to police it, and you've got to chase these things up, and you've got to impose fines. And fining somebody, yeah, you get some income, but it's a legal process. They might have to go to court, and that's very expensive. It may also be hard to set it at the right level. This is the problem with subsidies and taxes as well. It's really hard to calculate the external costs, the external benefits, so it's quite a crude instrument as well. And different, it comes down to those normative questions as well. Different cultures have different views, especially on alcohol. In some countries alcohol is completely banned. In other countries the age limits are really different. So America has a very different age limit to the UK, and in a country maybe like France, it's maybe more socially acceptable in terms of wine. That is, maybe other drinks it wouldn't be as socially acceptable. It doesn't raise revenue like an indirect tax would, but it's a nice evaluation factor that you can put here, that actually if you fine people, that's going to raise a bit of revenue as well. A good example of fines raising revenue for local councils especially would be speed, what are they called? Those speed things. You go through them, I don't know, I'm tired, it's Sunday morning. You get fined for going through with speed. It'll come to me later. So those yellow boxes, you drive past them really fast, you get fined. The effectiveness can sometimes depend upon PED. Now this is quite interesting. You have to think about what type of regulation this is. So sometimes regulation introduces policies and processes that make it a bit more expensive for firms to compete. So it could be health and safety legislation and things like that. They have to give people training. So what happens in that case is it shifts supply to the left. It kind of acts as a bit of a barrier to entry as well. But the effect that this has on the market here is, because we're shifting supply to the left, it's going to depend upon PED. Sometimes the legislation or regulation is like kind of more like quota, like a license. We only have a set limit in the market, so it might be a bit more like that. And in that case, if you shift it to the left, it's not going to depend so much on PED. But if your supply is upward sloping, if it's like health and safety regulations, then the amount that the quantity, the equilibrium quantity reduces by is dependent on PED. The more elastic it is, the more it's going to reduce the quantity demanded. Undesired effects, I'm going to go into more detail with this when I go into government intervention as well, government failure to be more exact. So black markets and those types of things can occur. And politically, they can be very unpopular as well. I still haven't think of it. In my mind, I'm thinking speeding machines, traffic, something. Those yellow boxes, though, I know they're unpopular. Pros and cons, though, of regulation. If it's to encourage someone to do something, it can actually be cheaper than a subsidy. So what's really interesting to look at is educational maintenance allowance, which has been kind of changed, but it used to mean that a lot of my students would get £30 a week to attend college, and they loved that, obviously. It depended on parental income. But now there are bursaries available. They're not so kind of freely available anymore, though, or a lot of people don't fully know what they're entitled to, so there can be problems with that. But also the compulsory school leaving age has gone up to 18, so you're meant to be in educational training. So the government kind of replaced EMA, which was a subsidy, with regulation, so meant that it was cheaper to impose. It can sometimes set a clear limit or a standard, so it's very, kind of, we're not just like subsidizing and saying, if you want to go to school, we'll make it free for you, you decide. It's like, no, you have to go to school. We believe that this is very important in our society, that everybody goes to school. So it can be like a stronger message of what culturally in our society we think is right and we think is wrong. Can be backed up with the use of fines, so that's a bit of a way to raise some revenue for those yellow speeding boxes things. I still can't think of what they're called. And can have I put instant effect there. It's not something instant, because obviously laws have to be passed and these have to be spoken about and debated. But it can be a little bit more quicker to impose than, say, an indirect tax of a subsidy. Usually that's announced with the budget in the April or end of March, and then it's the following year that that's implemented. Now, I have got a video here. I'll paste this into the bottom of my video, and this is all about prohibition in the US. So that was prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s, and it led to the rise of the kind of gangsters and unintended consequences there, so you can have a look at it. Now, alternatives, you've got to think about, again, what you're trying to reduce the market failure of. So when we've got overproduction, it's usually negative externalities and demerit goods, underproduction, positive externalities and merit goods. And so an indirect tax works well if you're trying to reduce overproduction. Subsidies work well as well if you're trying to reduce underproduction. The thing to warn you about, the best students will recognise that you hardly ever get any of these policies used in isolation. The government use a mix of all of these. So they'll put indirect taxes, possibly with this sugar tax comes through on unhealthy food. They put, especially in Blackburn with Darwin, I know that they were subsidising gym memberships. There's it's kind of state provision of education, so people get healthy eating information. There's information on TV, that Change for Life campaign and all that kind of stuff. So there's often, to deal with problems of obesity, there are often a range of policies available. So it's not just that the government use these in isolation. So that's a nice little kind of concluding paragraph, that none of these are ever intended to work in isolation.